Hello everybody, my name is Julie Phillips and I am a lifelong member of Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in Fond du Lac, and I just feel so privileged to have been asked by the Fond du Lac Public Library to give this presentation on the Greeks in Fond du Lac and their history. Well, if we want to go back in time, it was the early 1900s, or we might say the early 20th century, when the Greeks came to Fond du Lac. And it was these hard-working individuals who got our church started. All of them had businesses in Fond du Lac at one point or another. They worked on the railroad, they worked at Rooping Leather, and that was their start. And some even worked over at the Palace of Sweets, which was located in the old Huber building. But how did our church come to be? Well, here's first of all a map of how they all came, and this is Greece, where they came from so many miles away to make their home in our wonderful little town of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And there's the flag. Blue and white are the Greek colors. Well, actually, in about the early 19-teens, you might say, it was a group of people that were together, and the women urged the men, and they said, well, we got to have a church, we got to have a place of worship. Thus came St. Paul's Cathedral. And here's our sticker from our church now, celebrating our 100 years. But here's the congregation of St. Paul's Cathedral, who opened their doors to us back in 1914. And we went there to worship on some Sundays, thanks to St. Paul's Cathedral and my friend Robin here, who is a member of a church of St. Paul's Cathedral. We just are so grateful that they helped us along, in doing this. And we began to worship there. There were some weeks that the Greeks would worship in their homes because there was no church yet until 1914. And it was the year 1914 when the property of the old St. Louis School was purchased, which is now the site of Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church. And it was built and it was organized in 1916. And our first priest resident priest came in 1925, and his name was Father Alex Papastephanos. Father Alex, just like the itinerant priests before him, and the priests that up to this day travel in many different communities. They go to the northern communities like Neenah and Rhinelander and Wausau and all those places to minister to those who could not travel to Fond du Lac. So as you can see, our church does have many communities connected besides Fond du Lac. This is the church the way it was built in the beginning, and this is the way I remember it as a kid. The church then, up until about the 1980s when they started to renovate it. Another picture. This is the inside of the church when I was little. I still remember it that way. So it remained that way for quite a long time, because our church was first remodeled in 1925 with our first resident priest. And this is the church now, right? And this is our church as it is in the present after renovations, which were done more recently. This, in fact, was at our 100th anniversary, and the 100th anniversary took place in 2018. And this is the outside of the church. This is some very ornate artwork, and that's one thing about Byzantine churches. Everything was so ornate and just built perfectly. Here comes some ceremonies now that we're going to talk about. Well, in the early days, marriages and baptisms took place, and here's a picture of a bridal couple that was married in the early part of the 1900s. Look at the wedding gown and how they were both dressed. Such a change from the way the brides and grooms dressed through the years. And at this point, I just want to say that our church has seen many things, many weddings, many baptisms, and unfortunately, many, many funerals. Now, this was our consecration that took place in 1998. And a consecration is a baptism of a church, so to speak. And the bishop comes and he officiates. And it's just a very long, wonderful, beautiful ceremony that took place. And this is some of the altar boys that were involved. And outside they had a tree planting ceremony. And as noted in one of the earlier photos, there's this tree that has all these pink flowers, and that tree was planted back then. And one of our longer serving priests, Father Peter, is standing there with his robe on. See, we had many priests in our church, but our longest serving two priests were Father Peter Papadimitriou, who served from 1992 until 2015, and before that, Father George Sangranis, who served from 1973 until 1992. Like I say, we were blessed with many wonderful priests, but to my recollection, these are the two priests that served the longest. This was our 100th anniversary that took place in our church in 2018. And the 100th anniversary is the culmination of so many people that started up our church back in those early parts of the 1900s. The Greeks who came from their homeland in Greece, and who worked so hard to get us going. And then eventually those early church services that took place in the early 1900s. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you to all of our forefathers for getting this little congregation going. Well, these are the church presidents that served, and we paid tribute to them in 2018. Unfortunately, one or two of them have even passed from then, but these were the living presidents at that time. In the church, we have the choir and the chanter, who really are very important parts of the service. Here's our church choir. This is the first choir that was organized in 1925. And look at how many people were in the choir then. I think about back then, how many people sang in the choir, and how many people were even active in our church. Here's another picture of our choir. This is back in the 1960s. Now the next one shows how small we're getting. Now this was taken in 1998. But I said up until this day, we've only gotten smaller due to very unfortunate circumstances. Some people have moved away, people have married, and unfortunately, sadly, many have passed on. But this is the choir as we get smaller and smaller, and we still are going very strong as a choir. Another very important part of the service are the chanters. And these were two chanters that were pictured from the 1960s. Nick Elias was one, which I don't think anybody would know who that is, but our longest serving chanter was Tony Ignis, to your right. Now Tony served our church from 1967 until his death at the age of 90 in 2019. Tony came over from Greece, and he served our congregation for 52 years. And you will be listening to some very beautiful Byzantine music. There's Tony right there. And how lucky we were to have these people with us for so long. And these are the church organizations. We have the AHEPA, the Philoptochos, and the Goya, which stands for Greek Orthodox Youth of America. But starting out with the AHEPA organization, well, that is not really part of the AHEPA, it's just a performance that took place. And again, regressing back, we had so many fun times in our church. We'd have Greek school programs that were performed, Sunday school programs, and all that sort of thing. We just were a very, very active group, and considering how few we are, we're still very active. But anyway, I'm going to explain a little bit about the AHEPA organization. There's that group of men from the 1960s, I believe. Big group of men. And they did philanthropic goods, just like the ladies group, the Philoptochos, did, which I'll explain to that one later. But the men's group, what they did was they would help. They were like affiliated from New York, and they did all sorts of philanthropic help. Now onto the Philoptochos. It's just all that group of men there. That was a big group back then. Now we don't even have a chapter that's active anymore in Fond du Lac because there's just hardly anybody around anymore.
The dinner.
And this is a dinner, one of our dinners that we had in Greece, or in Fond du Lac, excuse me. Just a gathering place. We gathered so many people in our church.
Julie, how important was the church as a place for social events?
Very important. We were a huge gathering place because so many of the people who came over from Greece in the early years would get together at the church, and many of them were so lonesome for their old country and for their old customs. They just wanted to get together and they wanted to have a good time. They would eat together, they would dance together, they would talk about the old country. It was just a very, very important gathering place for everybody.
Do you have a favorite memory?
Yes, I have many favorite memories. When I was a little girl, and unfortunately I don't have that picture with me, we did many Sunday school programs. And we would get up and we would sing songs. And we'd have like little parties afterwards. And I remember the older people telling us stories about days gone by. And that just meant so much to me. And here's our Philoptochos group. Now this I can talk very much about because I'm president of the Philoptochos group at Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church at the moment. Philoptochos is a very rough translation for, friend of the poor. Philo means friend, and ptochos means poor, so thus we have the word Philoptochos. And they are also affiliated in New York and Chicago, and they help both national and international countries who have some fallen upon misfortune, either disasters or medical hospitals like the Ronald McDonald House, places like that. They help in all these charities. Our local chapter, which is in Fond du Lac, helps many families in need, and we also reach out to non-profit organizations who might need help, like homeless shelters and Broken Bread and places like that. And again, there was a huge amount of people in Philoptochos, but now, going to the last Philoptochos meeting that we had, we are now down to 13 members. That's what happens. As time goes by, we just get smaller and smaller, but we're still going along. Now this is the Goya, Greek Orthodox Youth of America. The Goya was very active in the 1960s, and they were a group of young adults who just got together and they went on little trips, like camping trips, about the church, they were like retreats is what they were, religious retreats. And they also had fellowship for the young. Again, we're down in those numbers. And here is the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church Greek folk dancers. And I can remember those programs like yesterday. I was too little to be in the group myself, but both my sisters and a lot of our people were in the group. And they would perform at various folk festivals. And they even did a couple of performances at which is now the Little Theater in Fond du Lac. And we used to enjoy those so much. They did little skits and they did dances and they went out to nursing homes. And so many people just fell in love with the Greek music and the ethnic customs that they had. And these are the altar boys. In the Greek Orthodox Church Divine Liturgy, we call it. Instead of Mass, we call it the Divine Liturgy because it's a reenactment of our Lord's life from beginning to end. The service is kept together by so many people. We have the choir, we have the chanter, and we have the altar boys who assist the priest in getting preparations ready for the service. So we have all these nice young men that are at the altar, and then there's an altar assistant or altar supervisor. And he plays a very, very important role in the church service because not only does he keep the altar boys together, he keeps the flow of the service going because he's a very big assistance to the priest. So it's very important that we have all these people who are part of this church. Opa. Now, how many people know what opa means? It's like, let's have a good time. And now we're getting into our Greek fest. And I can give you a little, now what does that say there?
Fall dance.
I'll give you a little history of our fall festivals, of our Greek festivals. Now here's just a bunch of people dancing and having a good time at one of our picnics and having fun. But actually, has anybody ever been to Greek Fest and know what that is? Well,
I have, and it's delightful to see so many happy people,
And we're having fun when we get ready for it because there's so much that went into that. But I'll explain as we go along here. In the very, very early years, we had Camp Shaganaki. Camp Shaganaki was the very first gathering for a Greek picnic. And again, it was all this fellowship, all these Greeks that were coming together to have a good time and to talk and to share and to dance and just to have fellowship and to make their loneliness for the old country not so bad anymore, because at least they had their memories that they could discuss. I wasn't around in 1925 for that. But then we had many, many church picnics, and one of them was the Pan-Samian picnic, which was also an annual event, and that was taken around the 1950s. And it was a group of people from Samos, Greece, and Samos is located in the northern part of Greece. And so many people were from that origin of that region of Greece, and they would get together, and they would have these picnics. Well, it was like in the 1950s that we moved to the back of our church. And we not only had Greek people, it was also becoming of interest to the non-Greek people. And they wanted to come and see what the Greek fellowship was all about and what the Greek traditions were about. So they came and they would eat Greek food and they would dance and they would have such a good time. In fact, they came so many and so much that it got to be too small of an area behind our church. So then we moved to the Fond du Lac County Fairgrounds. Thus was the birth of Greek Fest in 1979. Greek Fest went on from 1979 to the year 2017. There's a Greek Fest out there at the Fond du Lac County Fairgrounds. And that went on from 1979 until 2017, as I said. And the problem again was we just didn't have enough people to put these festivities or these events together. So then we moved to something else, and it was called Yidos number 2 instead of the word 2, but the number 2, the numeral 2, to go was born. And it was the Phillips Society that started that one. And it took fewer people than Greek Fest to get together. And we sold, yes, Yidos sandwiches. And at our Phillips event, we sold other things like Greek egg lemon soup, little spinach pies, and people just came from all over to buy those. It was a drive-through service, drive-through festivity. It was just so much easier to put on. And hopefully we'll be planning one of those in the spring again. We just had one of those in October with our parish council, and that was a lot of fun to do. But this is what happens with the church. So many people come, and then so many people, unfortunately, cannot help out anymore. But after 102 years, I can say we're still going strong. And God bless Holy Trinity, and God bless all of our forefathers. And also, I just want to take a moment, too, to say some of the Greek-owned businesses that were in Fond du Lac. There were many of them. One of them was Phillips Cafe. There was Stateson's on the corner of South Main Street. There was Dimet's Restaurant on North Main Street, Palace of Sweets on South Main Street, Chirolis' Restaurant, which was where Connie's Diner is now. Just so many hardworking people. I mean, I could go on and name more restaurants and more places, but it's just impossible to get everything in. And I just want to say thank you so much. And are there any questions?
Well, what brought some of those early Greek people to Fond du Lac?
A lot of them was friends, relatives. They came and they said, well, come to America, come to Fond du Lac, come to this little town. It's so welcoming and so nice and so intimate. You know, it was not like a large city. It was small. Everybody was friends with each other. Everybody was friendly. And I think that's what brought them.
Was it hard, do you think, for some of them to transition to living in Wisconsin?
I would think so. First of all, think about Greece. Greece has a Mediterranean climate, nice and warm year-round. Wisconsin, we have those long, hard winters. I'm sure it was difficult for them. And I think it was a little difficult for them to get even situated into the workplaces and so forth. It was not easy for them in the beginning. There were a lot of hardships. There was poverty. There was trying to make their first dollars. And, you know, a lot of that money was not kept in Fond du Lac. They sent that back to their parents, the gentlemen did, or they would send it back to their brides-to-be. Many was the time when the when they were engaged, they would maybe keep a little bit of money maybe for their needs, and then a lot of that money would be sent back to Greece for their brides, and eventually they could save up enough money and gain passage to come to America and then marry their sweethearts.
So how did they make Fond du Lac feel like their own home?
They made Fond du Lac feel like their home. Well, the one way was maybe by having these, by building this church and by getting together. See, there was a Greek community that lived out on Brook Street, Follett Street, Johnson Street, which is probably the reason why they built the church there on Macy and Johnson Street, because it was all that neighborhood. It was like word of mouth. One said to the other, well, I'm living here. We have this piece of property for sale. Would you like to come live closer? And eventually the community grew.
So can you tell me about maybe some of the key individuals from the Greek community over the years?
I can do that. There were some very key individuals. There was Spiro Callis, who came over from Greece. In fact, he was our first church president. And there were so many people. I mean, there were like the Galanuses, and there were the Exoduses, and they built their own businesses here. And the main aim was to get this church going so everybody could worship. And believe me, there was a lot of hard work that went into that. It wasn't just saying, well, we're going to buy this property. There was so much thought and so much energy put into this. How can we get these people together to worship? How can we get these people together as friendship, to build friendships? How can we establish all of this? And they were doing that, plus they were working 12-hour shifts, all of these people.
You mentioned they worked in 12-hour shifts. Did they work often in certain industries?
Yes, they worked either at roofing leather, and I think some of them may have worked on the railroad. Many of them worked on the railroad. And then there was a few people that there was this Palace of Sweets, which was downtown. I believe that's where Huber's Candy used to be. That's down on South Main Street. I can't think what's the exact location of Huber's.
Oh, I can't either, Julie. I remember it well, but...
I know it was on South Main Street, and so many people worked there. But I think the main employment would have been roofing leather and the railroad. And that was very hard, rigorous work. So I just marveled at how these people all did that, how they worked these 12-hour shifts, and eventually how they went on to own their businesses, and how they got this church going. I mean, I think it's marvelous.
What does that tell you about some of these early Greek immigrants to Fond du Lac?
Very determined people. Very determined, very industrious. And all they cared about was just getting the Greek community together and getting a church going. I mean, I can even think back myself, and I even came a little bit later in life, of all the fun we used to have downstairs in those church affairs that we had. There were the dances, there were the Sunday school programs, the Greek school programs. I mean, we just had wonderful times, and thank goodness for all these hardworking people. That's what I say.
Now, and did you mention your mother taught? Also?
My mother taught Greek school, yes,
Okay.
And Sunday school, because that's another thing that I want to touch on too. In the early years of our church, like about the 1920s, there was a teacher that came in. He taught Greek school, and he also taught religious studies, and he was paid a salary. Well, eventually that became too much money for the church. They couldn't afford that. So then people began to volunteer, either teaching Greek school or teaching Sunday school. I can remember as a little girl, the priests many times teaching the Greek school and the Sunday school and the religious classes. I mean, it was just our best experiences. I'll never forget them. My mother taught Sunday school and Greek school many years.
What is Greek school?
Greek school is when the people learn Greek as a second language, and I know that from a fact that many of our people had shared this with me, that they would go to regular school, like say, the elementary school or whatever, and then they would go to the church and they would learn how to read and write and talk Greek. That's what Greek school is.
Tell me about some of your childhood memories.
Oh, wonderful childhood memories. When I was a little girl, I can remember going to Sunday school, and I can remember going downstairs in the fellowship hall and having so many nice conversations with the priest, because he taught me a lot of things, and also with a lot of the older people. There were so many older individuals that were around them that knew all the stories from Greece. They would talk about about their vineyards, their grape vineyards, and they would talk about how they would grow the almond trees. In fact, my dad was born and raised in Greece, and he came to America in 1930. And I don't know if I should focus on this or not, but he met my mother in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And how it was, and I love to hear this story, I could just listen to it over and over. I wish that they were still here to tell me the story. How it was, my dad and his brothers, my uncles, had a restaurant in Green Bay, Wisconsin called Phillips Restaurant. And they worked there. And our priest at the time used to go back and forth to Green Bay. And he would see my dad, and he would tell my grandmother at the time, he said to my grandma, he said, I know a nice young man that lives in Green Bay, and I think he would be a really good match for your daughter. And of course, grandma said, okay, because see, back in those days, marriages more or less were arranged or fixed up. You know, you just introduced each other and that was it, you just went from there. Well, the story only gets better from there. Where I live now in my family home belonged to another Greek couple. And at that time, my mother went over to meet my dad. Within 3 months, they knew they cared about each other so much, they knew they got married. Because it was one of those love affairs, one of those love stories, like a fairy tale thing almost. So now, after so many years of marriage, 7 years of marriage, I believe it is, my mother and dad come back to Fond du Lac, and they buy the family home, which is where I've been living now all my life. So talk about a fairy tale. And there's just been so many beautiful memories, because before I came along, my grandparents, my parents, and my sisters lived there. And then we just kept things going.
Now, have you been to Greece?
Yes. In 1973, my mother, my dad, my sister, and I went to Greece. Well, my sister and my dad had been to Greece prior to that in '69, but my dad said to my mother, you got to come to Greece and you got to see it. And it was just the most wonderful trip. We went to the Acropolis, and we went to see my mother's family where they were from in Samos, which I think I explained to you, Samos is the northern part of Greece. And then we went to my dad's area, which was in the Peloponnese, so it was called Loga, which was an area of Kalamata in the province of Visinia, which was in southern Greece. And we got to see where my dad was born, and we got to go to some of the various places that were there. And I said that memory just stays etched in my memory. I'll never, ever forget it.
Do you feel like your Greek school early on and living in the Greek community helped prepare you for visiting Greece?
Most absolutely. Because when I first went to Greece, this was really something. I mean, my Greek, I could barely speak it. I mean, what I spoke at home with my mother and what she taught me was fine. But then I could barely speak the language. So then my mother and dad said, okay, we're going to leave you alone with your aunt and you're going to learn how to speak the language. And you know, when I came back from Greece, I was practically speaking it like a native. Because I was forced to talk Greek and I was forced to learn, and that was the best way.
And how old were you then?
Well, I was 12 when I went and 13 when I came back, which is, needless to say, I did celebrate my being a teenager in Greece.
So for people who are traveling around Fond du Lac, what places around Fond du Lac might they see that are tied to the Greek community over the years? Many places. Starting on North Main Street, we had Demet's Restaurant, which was situated on the corner of Johnson and Main Street. And before that, there were some other Greeks that owned it. I believe it was the Galanisses and then one of the Exoduses. I can't think what their names were, but they both went into partnership. And then you go a little bit further south by the Fond du Lac Theater. At that time was owned by the Frank brothers. If anybody knows the Franks brothers, they were Greek people as well. And they owned the Rutlaw Theater and the Fond du Lac Theater. And then if you go even further south on the corner of Main Street there on South Main is Stateson's Restaurant. Down a little bit further south on the same block is Adam Condell's Shoe Repair Store. And Adam Condell was also a Greek person, Greek American to be exact.
and he had a shoe repair place. And many was the time I can remember going with my dad and taking shoes either to be repaired or even polished, because back in the day everybody polished their shoes. And then a little bit down, like maybe about next to the Caramel Crisp, I don't know if anybody remembers that place or not. The Caramel Crisp was a popcorn place, and right next door, south of that, was Phillips Cafe. And Phillips Cafe was owned and operated by my parents, Steve and Virginia Phillips. I mean, they sold everything. It was like a regular little diner. They had the soups and the plate lunches, but of course the big specialty was my dad's Coney Island hot dogs. And before Phillips Cafe, in that very same building, where it was Jim Exodus's place, and he too had the chili dogs, but my dad just took a different take on the chili dog. But it was just a wonderful little place. Further south on Main Street, on that side of the street, but going down to where Connie's Diner is now, is the Chirolas restaurant. And I believe on that same side of Main Street, going a little bit further south, if I have the right location, I was too young to remember, to be honest, was Exodus's Bar. And it was not a regular bar or tavern, so to speak. They had pizzas, and it was almost like a regular restaurant. Many of the Greek-owned people that came to Fond du Lac, even though we called them taverns, they weren't really regular taverns or bars. They were regular, more like eating places. Then there was Mike Callis's place, and I'm trying to think where that was located exactly. I think more on North Main. I can't remember the exact location, but anyway, they also had food. And Mrs. Callis, Angeline, would always have a nice home-cooked meal for the people every day. And then, of course, across the street on South Main Street, I'm moving a little out of context here, was Huber's place, and it was the Palace of Sweets, which was a candy shop, and my uncle worked there. And that's where he learned the art of candy making.
Which uncle was that, Julie?
Well, he moved to Waukegan, Illinois, and then he passed away since. His name was Peter Phillips.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody would really have known him in Fond du Lac, though.
Okay, so, and what about the absolutely delightful man who had a store on Johnson Street?
Oh, well, there were two of them on Johnson Street. There was Miklas's, and right across the way from Miklas's grocery store was Mulliganus's. And they're the ones that had, well, you could go and get Greek grocery items at both stores. Many was the time I can remember going with my dad or my sisters down either to Miklas's or to Mulliganus's and buying the Greek feta cheese and the olives and having them at my table with my mom and dad.
I can just remember both of the places as a child in high school going. And they're very, very welcoming, always.
Oh, yes, they most definitely were. Both of them were, both Mr. Miklas and Mrs. Miklas, of course, and then across the way were the Mulliganuses. In fact, I have a memory here. When my sister Donna and I would go over to Miklas's, I can still see Mrs. Miklas coming up those stairs with those heavy barrels of olives. And I said, my goodness, I mean, the men were very successful in the businesses, but thank goodness for the wives. In the women, because behind the success of every man is always a woman.
Talked about some of the events that have occurred over the years. Maybe are there any favorite dishes that are traditional Greek dishes that would be very popular?
Very traditional Greek dishes that are very popular are, has anybody heard of domadas or stuffed grape leaves? Okay, what that is, and I still make them to this day, my mother's recipe, it's rice and hamburger and a little bit of garlic and onion and some spices, either dill or mint. And I always put a little celery and tomato in mine. And you roll them up into like a grape leaf. And my grapevine, I'm so lucky I have my grapevine in my backyard, and I can just go and pick them in the summer and I freeze them in the wintertime, and I just haul out a package and I make my stuffed grape leaves. And another one that's really good is called pastizo, and we used to sell that at our Greek Fest quite a bit. Pastizo is like Greek lasagna. It's macaroni and hamburger, and it's all layered together, and they put this real delicious bechamel sauce. In fact, I just made some last night, and I put it in my freezer. And I said, that'll be my meals for the winter. Such a popular meal. And kiftedes, which is like a round meatball, that's really good. They fry it up, and it's kind of like meatloaf, but it's like in a smaller version. Very good. Gyros, of course, is the king of all of them. Gyros is meat which is sliced real thin. It's a combination of beef and lamb, and it's all spiced up, and they put it in pita bread with a little, like tzatziki sauce they call it. It's like a yogurt and sour cream and garlic sauce, and you put that on top. And then you put a little sliced tomato and raw onion. They're to die for.
And where is it we go for them that I love it and I won't buy anything else?
She goes to Arby's,
Yeah.
but they're not really your authentic Greek gyros.
Oh, but they are.
But they are so good, aren't they?
Yeah.
And there's just, I can go on and on, but I know those are the more popular items that we have around Fond du Lac.
Well, what about this wonderful bread that you brought into my car warm yet?
Yes, I just baked it. That was my mother's recipe. We bake a lot. In fact, at Easter time, and you don't think about this. They say hindsight is better than foresight. It's Easter time, we make this round bread, and we put a red dyed egg in the middle, and we call it Easter bread. And the red, of course, the red dye, of course, represents the blood of Christ that was shed when he was crucified, and then how he was finally resurrected. But anyway, that red egg is placed in the middle of the bread, and it's a round loaf, and you take a little bit of a strip of dough and you put that around the egg, and everybody just loves it. And then at New Year's, another tradition is called vasilopita, and that too is the same bread recipe, as I think you've had that. And you make a round loaf, and then you write like whatever the New Year is like. For example, you take your bread dough and you etch 2020, which is 2020, and then you put a quarter in one of the sides of the bread, and the lucky person that gets the quarter has good luck for that year. This year it was my nephew.
Are there other traditions that the Greek community like to observe?
Yes, Holy Week is a very big tradition in our church. And every night, beginning on Lazarus Saturday, which is the day that Lazarus' resurrection is celebrated, all the way through till Easter Sunday, and that's actually held at midnight when Christ is risen. There's a church service every day. And Holy Sunday, or Palm Sunday night, Monday and Tuesday, are called the bridegroom services. And then Wednesday night is called Holy Unction, and that's when each parishioner gets anointed with oil to heal his infirmities, or hers. Thursday morning, there's a divine liturgy, which is commemorating the Last Supper of our Lord. And then Thursday night is what they call the Passion Service, when the crucifixion is commemorated. Now, the next question I bet you're going to ask is, why Thursday night and not Good Friday? Well, there's a reason for that. According to the Bible and according to Orthodox dogma, after sundown, a new day is celebrated. Or is not celebrated, but is whatever, is the next day. So like say sundown Holy Thursday would actually become Good Friday. And then Friday afternoon is the burial service of our Lord. Friday night is the Lamentations. Saturday morning is what they call a divine liturgy. And then Saturday night going into midnight Sunday morning is the Easter service. And the Easter service is when the resurrection of our Lord is celebrated. And what we used to do in the past, of course this year we didn't do anything like that because of our pandemic, but what we've always done in the past, after the church service on Easter, there was always a lamb dinner to celebrate. And people would attend our lamb dinner. And see, every year at Easter, it's a tradition that we have roast lamb.
Now, we've talked a lot about Fond du Lac's Greek community. Are there other Greek communities around Wisconsin? And
Lots of them.
Would they get together or interact?
Yes, there are other communities. We have Madison, we have Milwaukee, there's St. Constantine and Helen Church and Annunciation Church. And then we have Sheboygan St. Spiridon Church. And I did say Madison, didn't I? Okay. And those churches I know for sure get together. And the one year that they have an opportunity to do that for sure is on Pentecost. See, we have the Vespers of Pentecost, which is the night before the actual day. We always have Vespers. And then what we do is we have a reception downstairs hosted by our Philoptochos. And then the churches and the priests get together and they help officiate at the service. And then they come downstairs, they have a little cake and coffee, or if we decide to cook something up like a little meatballs or something like that, we all just sit together and we talk. And that to me just means everything, getting together and talking with people.
What does the future hold for Fond du Lac's Greek community?
We're going strong. Even though we're fewer and fewer in numbers, we still are going strong because there's still our small hardworking nucleus that keeps things going. And I pray that, okay, we're at 102 years old right now. I just keep hoping and praying we can go on for many, many more years.
So can you speak Greek? Can you read and write Greek?
I don't read and write Greek, but I can speak a little bit. Want me to say a little sample?
Sure.
Okay. Είμαι τόσο χαρούμενη να είμαι μαζί σας να δώσω presentation, I can't think of the word, για τις Έλληνες στο Fond du Lac. I'm just so privileged to be a part this afternoon of giving this presentation about the Greeks in Fond du Lac. Thank you so kindly.